census in that was taken in one, we can view it in 2021. So in a couple of years we can be able to see it. I will sit down. Is that better? Oh, we see. Right. Okay. Yeah.
You sit down.
Fine. Okay. So I put on there that this is the last one we're going to see. Because in 1931 the census was lost in a fire, so we have no records left. And in 1941 it didn't happen because of the war, so we won't see another one. So
not many.
No, we won't. We won't see that one. And I was very conscious when I was doing it that 1921 was not long after 1918, so the effects of the war were still very, very prominent in the village. They were only just sort of getting over it, and some men didn't come back till 1919, so they hadn't long been back. This is just a resume of, we had 176 men roughly serving. There were 7 women that served officially, but of course a lot more were doing war work that wasn't ever recorded properly. We had 22 who died, 30 in the parish magazine. The rector at the time was recording messages that he got back from the front, and he would say so and so had been wounded and so on. So this isn't necessarily totally accurate, but he thinks 30 were wounded. There were 2 prisoners of war. 1 with shell shock that we know about, there may have been more, and 1 was gassed. Whether that was the same person, I don't know. Most of these records are for, well, they are for Somerset that I've been looking at. And within Somerset, you have Axbridge District Council, which is what we were part of, the Rural District Council. And Axbridge lost 364 men. Apparently, the average over the whole country was 3.1, calculated. I think ours was slightly more than that, and I'll show you later. I was expecting to find a lot of extra women, widows, and certainly in Somerset, there was an increase over the 1911 of an extra 1,065 women who were now on their own, widowed. So this you'll be familiar with. This is what is in the church, in the memorial chapel, the names of the 22 men. The chapel was begun in 1919 in their memory, and it took quite a few years to finish, so 1923, before it was finally dedicated. And there are 2 memorial windows in there as well, which were also completed in 1923 to the men of Blagdon. Doesn't mention the women, you note. So who did they leave behind? I went through the 1921 census, having a look at those names of the people who died to see whether they were still in the village or not. So we had William Best, he was no longer, or his family were no longer in Blagdon, obviously he wasn't. Lord Buxton, his parents were at Nordrack. William Cattell, or Cattle, Cattell, is it? Right, okay. His parents were working, or his father was working at Hazel Manor as the gamekeeper, and they've put a brass plaque into the church at Charterhouse, which some of you will have seen up there in St. Hugh's. Then we had the Coates. Now there were 2 Coates brothers, Edward, who was called Ted, and Ernest Richard, who was known as Dick. They were both sons of Rosina and Samuel. By 1921, Rosina was a widow, so she'd also lost her husband by that time. Richard was married, and his wife lived in Bedminster, as he had done before the war, I think. And they had 2 children. One was Ernest, and we think maybe actually his Ernest wasn't with an A, it should have been ER, but it was recorded as EAR. And Irene, who was born in 1916, and he died in 1916. So probably never saw her. The Furbanks, they were living in Aldwick Court, and they gave a pyx, which is a holder for the Eucharist bread, to the Memorial Chapel in honour of their son Godfrey Joseph. Charles Frost, difficult to know much about him and why he was on the local list. No parents or relatives that we could find, and he was actually buried in Luton. He was given a military medal, but we think he'd worked as a gardener locally, and he'd obviously been taken into the hearts of the people locally, and they recorded him on the church plaque. The Harrises, they were in the High Street, and he was married. Alvan Oscar was married. He married a Mary Alice Saville, and they were living at one time at Channel View up on the hill. They had a son, Arthur Bernard, but by 1921 she'd returned to her parents in Cheshire and was living with them. I put this picture, and it's a familiar one, I know, the people who were working down at Coombe Lodge well before the war. But in the front row, the young men, we've got Dick with the black armband on, don't know for whom, Ted, so that was Edward, and their father, Sam, sitting in the front row there. So you can see they were still quite young at the time. Then we had Herbert Hemmons. His parents ran the Highgrove Bakery in Bath Road, and there's a cross for him in the churchyard. Richard Hill, his parents lived at Hazel Manor, wealthy shipbuilders, and they then went on to Claverton Manor. Arthur Nelson, so that's a familiar name because his parents had the post office and the drapery shop. Oliver Gwynn, who was the son of Oliver, who was a GWR driver, and they lived down in Mount Pleasant in Grib Lane, the parent. Packer, Francis William Packer, worked in Redwood Stores. I don't know about where his parents came from and how he came to be there, but he lived in Orchard Cottages behind the post office, and he is buried in the churchyard, and there's a family cross for him, and there's also a Commonwealth War gravestone, which was put in apparently much later. At the time that he died, his family didn't want a formal military recognition, but some later relatives decided it should be and had it put in not so long ago. And his wife, Lucy, married Frank Paynes of Vale Farm in 1921. So as far as I know, she's the only widow who continued to live locally. And so there's the cross that was put up by the family in memory of Francis William George, beloved wife of Katie Packer. And then there's the Commonwealth Award grave. He was a machine gunner, and he died of wounds back here, I think, or nearby, so that he was buried here in Blagdon. Robert Sampson, familiar name because they ran the Grove Cottage newsagents. 1921, there were another 4 sons and 2 daughters. Stowells, they were high street carriers. And it took a long time to find him because on his certificate, which the Commonwealth War Graves produced, it said he was the son of Mr. T. Stowell, but I'm pretty sure that was him. Somebody, Stuart Alec, again, we don't know anything about his family, but he was working for the farmer Isaac Bath, and so he became familiar to people in the village. And then John Tunstall, who I think came down from Scotland as a gamekeeper, he was boarding with the Chipsey family at Yoxter, and he married their daughter, Alice May, and she remarried after the war to a farm worker in Wedmore. So again, she didn't stay in the area. Leo Frick Wood, one of the many brothers with the Ick names from Frederick Wood. He'd actually gone to Sydney in 1914 and then joined up with the Australian infantry there, died at Gallipoli. And then these 3 youngs caused Sheila and myself quite a lot of headache because 2 of them were called, there were 2 George Herberts, one from each family, which was very confusing. But Frank Young and Percy Young were both sons of the same parents, John and Georgina of Street End. And their brother Bert, who was actually George Herbert, was a prisoner of war for 10 months and later drove the Wills estate lorry. So he did come back. But another George Herbert, who was born in Ubley, son of the bailiff there, and whose family were at one time at Charterhouse, so he was in the local school, Charterhouse and Blagdon schools are remembered on that plaque in the church. They moved to Fayland, and so we found that actually, although he is named on the brass plaque in the church, he's not in the book, in the roll book, but he is named as Herbert G on the Wraxall War Memorial, which is obviously near Fayland. So, no, these all died. It was the son of Rosina, John and Georgina, who came back. Yes, that was a brother of Frank and Percy, another George Herbert, but he was known as Bert Young. Yes. Is she? Right, that's interesting. Okay. In fact, these are the Youngs. That's Bert Young at the bottom, so he didn't die. And he's actually parked in the estate lorry in front of where we live now, when it was a shop. There's the Wraxall War Memorial with Herbert G. And then Frank and John Young are on the right of the picture above. Frank's the young lad, and his father is in the bowler, John Young, who was gardener for Wills. So this census unusually took place in June instead of March and April. There was a lot of industrial action going on in early 1921. And also somebody suggested that if you had it later in the year, you'd get some slightly more accurate data because some of the holiday destinations would have tourists there who would always be there in the summer, I suppose. Most of the statistics, as I said, apply to Axbridge District Council, but a few are divided into the villages. So where I've been able to find actual Blagdon data, I've used that. Unlike the 1911 census, people didn't have to declare how many children they'd had altogether. On the 1911 one, they had to record how many children they'd had and how many they'd lost and how many were still living. On the 1921, they didn't. They did have to record any children living at home under 16, but that was all. And there was also no longer a column for infirmity, which there was on the 1911 one. So you won't be able to see that very clearly. Well, not too bad, actually. That's an example of the census form. So I've put along the top what they were looking for. So they looked for your name, your relationship to the head of the family, age in years and months, marital status, place of birth, your occupation, your employer, your place of work. And then the children under 16 went into that little grid at the end. You put their names, and then which age you could tick. And then there were the number of males and females in the box on the bottom left, and a total, and the number of rooms, and then it was all signed by the enumerator who was collecting the data. So the population, putting it into local villages, you can see we've got Blagdon there. So there were 915 recorded for 1911 and 958 for 1921. So during the war years, I guess it was somewhere in between the two. And that meant that 22 dying out of, say, 940 odd gives us a percentage of about 4 plus a little bit dying rather than the 3.1 nationally. And you can see I've just highlighted Buckham and Charterhouse because they're nearby. So Buckham's population went up quite a bit, whereas Charterhouse is not very much. They also recorded how many families there were living in separate dwellings and the population within those families, the number of dwellings in the village, how many rooms were occupied, and the persons per room ratio, if you like. And for Buckham, the families were the same as the number of dwellings. Similar for Charterhouse. So in Somerset as a whole, looking at male employment, all the different possible trades or professions are listed, but the vast majority, 363 out of 1,000, were employed in agriculture over Somerset as a whole. And the next highest was mining or quarrying, 70 out of 1,000 in those. And for Blagdon, this time it's not out of 1,000, this is actual persons. And this isn't totally accurate because sometimes people recorded themselves as a farmer or an agricultural labourer or just a labourer, and they might have been on a farm. So there were 88 in 1911, 76 in 1921, so not many less. Whereas the servants had been 38 in 1911, only 14 calling themselves servants in 1921. And some of those were working for businesses, as we'll see later. Apart from 5 I know about who were in Coombe Lodge. And there was only the sister of George Wills living there, Hilda Wills, and she had 5 maids just for herself in that big house. That's living in. I mean, there may have been others coming in during the day, of course. But that servants one does tell us a little bit more about the women's occupations, because most of the ones that were servants were women, whereas most of the agricultural workers were men. Hauliers, none left in 1921, but there were 8 motor engineers, as you might expect, motorcycles and motor cars, drivers or engineers. and no dressmakers left. That was something that people relied on a lot in 1911, not by 1921. So the major employers in Blagdon, as you might expect, the Wills Estate, Bristol Waterworks, big, Crawford's, which we'll come back to, was a building contractors based in Churchill Langford area, Millier and Sons, the builders at Rickford, GWR, because we still had the railway line and the station, and in hospitality and care. So we'll come back to those later and you'll see what I mean by that. I've put this in because it was a bit interesting to us. Obviously, tobacco was very important for the Bristol area. And we could tell from the census that there were 129 workers in the tobacco industry in Axbridge area, 63 in Long Ashton, 24 in Keynsham, so obviously all linked to the Bristol works. That nobody in Blagdon put themselves down as a tobacco worker. But we do know that quite a few of the young people moved to Bedminster, where it was cheaper and easier to find housing. And a lot of those probably did work for the tobacco industry. In fact, the wife I mentioned of Dick Coates, who was widowed, they were living in Bedminster, and she was a tobacco worker, originally anyway. And it was also known that the Wills Company would send their workers who were suffering from TB to be boarded out in the village. Rosemary Hodges used to say they tried to keep it a bit quiet that they'd got any TB in their works, but that they were sent to Blagdon to recover, and they were paid, their board was paid for out here. And then a little bit of an indulgence in a way, that'd be interesting to Marion and Chris. There was a New Zealand link, and Martin and I went there not so long ago and discovered that in Motueka, which is a very small place, the top of South Island, there is this garden in memory of, or put up, grown by WD&HO Wills Limited, New Zealand Limited, and they called it the Pethybridge Rose Gardens, and it was in memory of a chap who had worked for them there, whose name was Pethybridge, and Charles Pethybridge, and he'd worked for them for 50 years. And so they gave this garden for the pleasure and use of the citizens and visitors to the district. And it's still there, looked after now by the local council, beautiful roses. And you can walk around in there. They didn't make, as far as we know, particularly cigarettes and cigars there, but they did produce the leaf, which was then exported. They kept on doing that actually until 1989, so for a long time. But it was huge. Sorry. Perry? I don't know. Oh, maybe. Perhaps they named it after. I think it was this chap though. His name was Pethybridge. So, yeah, could be. So they produced dried leaf, and when we went there, it was pointed out to us that the big building at the back of the garden used to be where they dried the leaves, and it's now the local crematorium, which is a bit appropriate. And they had obviously a big department and a little museum in the village. Those are Wills workers standing outside the leaf department with a brass plaque saying, and I think the two buildings down at the bottom would be drying sheds. And it was really big business in the whole of that area, completely gone now. And it's all apple growing and hop growing now, but it was obviously very fertile. I put this in not because you want to read all the names, but just to show you there were 43 men working for the Wills estate. So a big proportion of the men in the village. Some of them were gardeners, some were doing farm work. He had carpenters, cowmen, gamekeepers, foresters, lorry driver, that's the young, one of the youngs. Gamekeeper, as I think I may have said, a woodman. So all sorts of different trades, all working there on the estate and for the estate. And of course, there were also people who lived in Langford and Burrington also working for the estate. So there were more than just these Blagdon workers. Some familiar names there. The waterworks was still a big employee as well, and it was considered a really good place to work. People worked there for a long time, and then if they did work there for their lives, they came out with quite a good pension as well. So there were 18 men, and Annie Pierce, who used to manage the fishing lodge. She was down there as a charwoman, but I think she was a bit more than just a cleaner. She made the tea and sandwiches and whatever else. And then recently, Martin and I went into the record office in Bristol, where they've got their Bristol Water records meticulously written out of all the workers. I'm sure they don't do it in the book now, but it was beautiful copperplate writing of all the workers that they had, when they were allowed to have a pay rise and when they weren't. So we've got the more of the construction people now. You've got Milliers, and I remember these are only people living in Blagdon, so they would have had more than this. Crawford's, they were public works contractors, and they were operating in Langford at this time. Mostly they were labourers, but there was down there a civil engineer who was obviously a professional in charge, and a crane driver, something to do with mechanical joints. I'm not sure what that was, probably perhaps to the pieces of the tunnel. And then another familiar name, Puddy, he was a builder, and he employed quite a few local people as well, building houses. So masonry, brickwork, and so on. And I've put the other three down the bottom there, Fred Linton, Frank and Stanley Wilson. They also worked for Crawford's, but they weren't living in Blagdon. They were registered in Burrington. Yeah. They were obviously quite a big employer at that time. Millier was well known as a good employer as well. That's him standing in the middle with possibly a cigar and a hat. And I think it's his son who's either just behind him to the left of him, or the other one in the hat. I'm not quite sure. He was certainly in that back row. Actually, I did record which one he might have been, the middle row. Yeah, I think he's the second one in, actually. Yeah. And they went every year on an annual outing, sometimes actually a whole weekend. But this was one to the River Dart. And somebody has recorded a lot of the names there, and they're very familiar names. There's a little bit about Crawford's, because Sheila and I didn't really recognise who they were to start with, but they were a big company, I think based in Edinburgh, and they were contracted by Bristol Water to build a pipeline, which was going to bring water from Cheddar Pumping Station. This is before the days of the reservoir, so using the springs in the gorge, and via Roborough Tunnel, which some of you might have heard about, seen the sort of grid that goes to it. They started it in 1920, and I think it finished in 1927. We were going through the books in the Archive Centre, and we got as far as 1927 when this particular tome ended. And I think it was finished, but there was never any minute in the director's minutes saying it's open, or now we're pumping every day, or anything like that. So maybe we needed just to go a little bit further. And then they needed more water still, so Cheddar Reservoir was constructed in the 1930s. If anyone's interested, Andrew's printed out for me a map showing where that pipeline went from Cheddar to the lake here, to the Blagdon pumping station and into the lake, and then round the lake, joining in with our water here, up into Bristol. It's quite an interesting map. It's on the table if anyone would like to have a look. As with Pethick's, if you've heard me talk about the building of the dam and the reservoir, Bristol Water seem to be, they always seem to go for the cheapest tender, cheapest quote, and then they wonder why those people sort of have money problems. And all the way through this minute book, Crawford's was asking for extra money. Could he have a loan? He couldn't pay his men, and so on. And sometimes the directors would say no. And in the end, there was quite a big dispute when they were claiming money back, and it all went to arbitration. And Crawford's, I think, actually came out best in that particular transaction. But it happened over and over again. They would choose the cheapest quote, and then the people who put the quote in found they couldn't actually do it. Prices were going up hugely in 1920s. Wages were going up, and they couldn't keep up with what they'd originally estimated. A newspaper account here, this is the actual tunnel. It was big, and it was being put through the rocks at Roborough. And there was an accident in 1921, a fatality. A chap died there. And the writing at the bottom of the picture says, a passage is being excavated through Churchill rocks for the mains which are to bring Cheddar water to the Bristol public. It was obviously a huge construction. What I don't know is whether when they finished that contract in 1927, Crawfords were given any more by Bristol Water, whether they had anything to do with building the Cheddar Reservoir, or whether that was it. I haven't found that yet. Working for GWR, so we've still got the station master, engine drivers. And this was actually a postcard which was printed with A. Nelson's name on, selling it in the shop. Well-known, familiar photograph, I know.
That's Nelson's from.
I assume so. Mm. Now this place was, you're all familiar with the Mendip Bungalow Hotel and the picture there. They played croquet there, they had tennis courts. It was advertised as being enlarged for 1921, redecorated and fitted with electric light, which was fairly early on for the village. 600 feet above sea level, extensive views, touring centre for Cheddar, Wells, Glastonbury, etc. And lunches, teas and dinners all being served up there. And there were 29 rooms, it was big. And at the time of the census, they had 22 visitors, so a lot of rooms filled. There was one live-in chambermaid, but they must have had more coming in, I'd have thought. And there were two couples who were engaged in the kitchen and waiting work, but they were living in nearby cottages in Rodgate, not far away. So this was actually a cutting from 1920, just before we're talking about. This is Blagdon House, you'll recognise, and this was set up as a nursing home. It was, oh, Blagdon Court, quite right, quite right. Yeah, nursing home is what I had in my mind, I suppose. Yes, Blagdon Court. And Matilda Hallen, who was a registered nurse, opened it as a nursing home initially from 1921, and then she took in guests as well. In 1921, there were 2 inmates and 4 patients. I don't know whether the inmates were differentiated for a particular reason or what it was, but 4 patients, 1 nurse, plus Matilda Hallen herself, who was a trained nurse as a matron. Then she had, interestingly, 3 domestic servants, young girls, youngish girls, each with a young baby, literally months or a year old at the most. So whether she was helping out unmarried mothers to come and live there, I don't know. A lady gardener, a child niece and a cousin all living there. And then there was Nordrack Sanatorium, which was obviously a big employer too. In the census, there were 32 staff, some of whom were from Blagdon, others from East Harptree, Ubley, Burrington, around the area. Looking after 44 patients. I mean, they had a lot of female maids who were presumably looking after rather than nurses a lot of the time, looking after the patients. And 44 patients, many of them under 40. So these were young people with TB. And they have to be people with some money. It was quite expensive to go there, but they were being sent from all over the country to Nordrack. And it was very much a regime of fresh air, being outside. The picture at the top is actually 1918. That's one of the earlier buildings. And then the one at the bottom is a newer one. And there were also some other little sort of chalets in the grounds so that people would live in these wooden buildings outside. I gathered they actually put them into families in the village, but it's possible they did send some up there. But mostly they were people from pretty far-flung places around the country, really. Yeah, yes. Who was that, sorry? Oh, that's right. Yes, of course. Yes, yes, he was. Yeah. And he might be listening actually on the Zoom. Yeah. And then I've just finished off with this one as a typical of 1922, really. There was this athletic sports, baby show, all being held on the recreation ground, prizes of up to £60, and Bristol GPO band. I don't think GPO have got a band anymore that I know about. They haven't got any workers. But there were going to be races for the children, dancing between 7 and 11, teas, refreshments, sports, baby show. And somebody from Rock Cottage and Godwin, which is a name which comes up quite often. I think he was a bailiff, for Wills possibly, living in the village. There's the familiar one at the bottom of the football team. And then the school, as they would have looked in 1921 with their gym slips and little suits. So that's a sort of quick run through, really. And thank you for your patience waiting for it. Any observations or questions? People you knew about? Oh, yes, yeah. He was, yes, sorry, his name though. Avery, that's right, yes, yeah. Yes, I think they were. Let me just check, because I have got the names on here. The familiar ones like Gilling, Gibbard, Day, Pryor. I don't see an Avery, so perhaps he came a little bit later, maybe. Yeah, not there anyway. No. Good. Just before we finish, the programme for next year, you'll have had your card if you joined up again or are going to join up again. In addition to those evenings that we put in there, we're hoping to do several trips, outings as well. Some of those will be with Living Well. Some of them we might do on our own. In particular, depending on interest, if some of you know Alistair Barr and Charles Crawford as well, they are guides at Wells Cathedral. And we have an opportunity, if we would like, to go to the chained library in Wells Cathedral, which Alistair Barr is particularly interested in. And we could go, yes, okay. Well, I think they'll only take 8 people at a time. But if people are interested, then let me know, and I can start to sort of find a date. Thank you for coming. No, that's all right. No, we finished. So let me know if that one's of interest. I don't think Living Well will be doing that one, so we'll just have a smaller group from here. But then if you've got other suggestions, actually it's just gone. Eamon has said that he will do a tour of the sandstones because he's going to talk about those. And we've got various other possibilities lined up. And we will do at some point an exhibition, possibly in October. But that's not, we haven't got a date for that yet, but it will happen at some time during the year. Good. Thank you very much. Right. One day we'll go seamlessly into a Zoom session. What we did last time, actually. It's because we couldn't set it up from the very beginning, wasn't it? No, sorry about that. Yeah. Yes. Yes. There is. Well, I think it must be. I don't know for certain, but we're assuming. Yeah, we've looked at that and assumed it's probably something to do with it. Yeah, have a look at the map. Yeah. Good. Is it? Have you been able to go into it then? No. All right. Oh, yeah, interesting then. That's some time ago then.
Sorry. No, sorry, no.
Sorry, do you need to switch this on?
Okay.
Used to do the
Yeah. Oh, I can't see.
Right.